This sight isn't hard to believe. We're up over the trees now, and we're coming in over the top of the main stage of this music festival. And for easily a half a mile, all we can see on this hilltop are people.
And a great pleasure to welcome back a good friend of ours and a good colleague of ours as well, who lives right here in Sarasota. But as this is once again the 50th anniversary, a lot of things happened in 1969. We're going to be talking about one of those great events that happened in August of 1969, Woodstock, a great seminal rock and roll concert that took place in upstate New York, and a man who covered that for one of the great radio stations of all time, WNEW, 1130 in New York, Mike Eisgrau, joins us now. We did one of these about 10 years ago, but we want to do one for the 50th, and Mike's going to kind of reminisce a little bit about covering that event and what went on and what it means back then, what it meant back then, what it means today. And Mike Eisgrau joins us on the telephone today. He's in Sarasota. And Mike, I know we haven't done this in 10 years to talk about Woodstock, but good to kind of reminisce with you.
Well, Doug, it's a pleasure to be with you, and one of the most important things that I would say to begin this little discussion is that 10 years later, we're both still here.
That's always a plus.
And so I can say that 50 years later, Woodstock is still in my mind, in my memory. 1968 and 69, when I was a young fella, a young reporter in New York, were two of the most exciting years. As a matter of fact, 67, 8, and 9 were three of the most exciting years that I've had as a reporter. As you mentioned, there were so many important things going on in 68. When I came back from the Midwest, from anchoring some television in the Midwest, I came back to 4 riots in 2 weeks. And I had just started working for WNEW, Spanish Harlem. The big one was Newark riots, where 34 people were killed, and we had a report from underneath the news unit because the bullets were flying. And then in 68, of course, we had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and of course the incredible Democratic Convention in Chicago, and all of which, working for WNEW, which was owned by Metro Media Broadcasting at that time, I had the honor of covering. And of course, we move on to 1969. And in 69, it was a hot August day in 1969. And I'm in the newsroom in New York, and my editor, Carolyn Tanton, she was on the desk there. She's very concerned. I got a bad situation up there, a bad situation. I have to get somebody up there. You, Eisgrau, you're going. I said, where? She said, Woodstock. And I said, what's that? And she said, you'll find out. And that was my introduction to that iconic event, which took place 114 miles northwest of Manhattan. And what's interesting about that is that 90 minutes before I arrived at Woodstock, I didn't even know what Woodstock was. I was covering crime and politics, other local stories. And so within 25 minutes, believe it or not, they had me outfitted with tape recorders and tapes, and everything's digital nowadays, but tape recorders and tapes, and pads and pencils, and luckily a raincoat, and they whisked me out to LaGuardia Airport. And my editor had found out that there was a medical emergency flight on a little old DC-3 twin-propeller airliner going up with doctors and nurses and medical supplies and flying up the 114 miles to what, when we landed, was known as the Sullivan County International Airport. I got off, and it was a grass strip. I looked at the guy and said, what are you talking about? Sullivan County International Airport. And he puffed up his chest and said, we have one flight a week to Toronto. Okay. Well, if I can continue this, Doug, the roads around Max Yasgur's farm, where Woodstock actually took place, it took place almost 100 miles from the actual town of Woodstock near the Hudson River in New York. The roads around Max Yasgur's farm for 20 miles around were completely clogged. People trying to get to this iconic festival. They didn't know it was iconic. They just knew they wanted to get there. They used to leave their cars all over the roads because they just couldn't move them anywhere. And they decided they could get to the site on foot. The planners for Woodstock thought that they would get about 50,000 people. They received an estimated 400,000 people. Well, how do you get into the site? Another reporter and I believe a New York Daily News photographer, made a cash deal with a chopper pilot to chopper us in the 8 miles directly into the site. And you know, Doug, I'm sure you know this, any good radio reporter, if they're up at 500 feet in the air, they are talking into their tape recorder describing what they saw. And the best I can remember what I said was, this site is hard to believe. We're over the top of the hill now and over the main stage, and for perhaps half a mile, all you can see are people. Well, when we landed, the chopper pilot said, fellas, I didn't want to bother you, but all the way over, I was losing oil. What? You were losing oil? We got down safely, and the first kid I met was stark naked. I won't go into any more graphic descriptions, Doug, but he was stark naked. I whipped out my microphone. Pardon me, young man. I said, don't you feel a bit peculiar in what you're not wearing? He said, hey, baby, me. He says, what about you? And then I realized they'd hauled my rear end out of New York City so fast I was standing in the middle of Woodstock in a tie and jacket. Talk about being out of place.
This sight is hard to believe. We're up over the trees now, and we're coming in over the top of the main stage of this music festival. And for easily a half a mile, all we can see on this hilltop are people. You're as naked as a jaybird. You gonna drive? No, not me, thanks. Okay. How does it feel walking around in your birthday suit? Have you got high yet? Not yet, no. Man, you really should. Nobody seems to be bothered by the type of outfit you're not wearing. It doesn't seem to bother you either, does it? No. Are you high now? Yeah. And that doesn't bother you either? No. I think it's beautiful.
You know, it's 1969. It's not 2019. We didn't have satellite phones and all sorts of internet connections. So how do you get the story from Woodstock down to, or from Max Yasgur's farm, down to New York City? It's what I call kosher ingenuity. As I'm standing on the hillside there, big young kid comes by with a big box on his shoulder. And I said to him, what do you got in there? And he says, are you the guy, I'm from Kaplan's Deli in Monticello. Are you the guy who ordered these corned beef and pastrami sandwiches? Yes, I did. I whipped out $10 to give him a tip. He never saw that big a tip in his life, and I got the box. In those days, the state police had to have some sort of command and control up in this place where they had 400,000 people. They brought in a communications trailer. It was a big trailer with phones that AT&T, I guess at that time, hooked up by wires. Everything's so much wireless today. And it had phones, and thank God it had toilet facilities and all that. So I went over to the trailer, and I made a deal with the state troopers. If you let me use, not all the time, whenever I need it, one of your phone lines to call back down to Manhattan, and of course, the facilities, I'll keep you supplied in corned beef and pastrami sandwiches for the weekend. And they bought it. I don't know why they bought it, but they bought it. So that's the way I was able to get, and most people nowadays don't know, but you would know, Doug, we were able to clip on to the actual phone handset, plug it into our tape recorder, talk through our microphone, and feed stuff down, both what we call actualities, that's little parts of interviews, and our voicers and things that we did. And that's the way I got through. That weekend. By the way, that was a Friday. I think I was there for 2 nights. And when you're young and all that sort of stuff, you don't sleep much. You just do what has to be done. In any event, it was quite a time, and I must tell you, the squarest guy at Woodstock those days, is talking to you on the phone. I was thinking Bing Crosby and Benny Goodman, and they're talking to me about some woman named Janis Joplin and The Who. I asked the kid, who? He said yes. So that's the way Mike Eisgrau was able to do Woodstock. And remember, I had 25 minutes notice. So you get dropped into this iconic festival. You're surrounded by kids half naked, half clothed. And you turn around, you start talking, you do react interviews. You're not going to get to the performers on the stage. So you do reaction shots, you do all sorts of feature materials, you have a lot of great voices on there, a lot of them cackling because many of them were high. The not so nice part of it had to do with the word high. So many kids there were tripping on drugs and all sorts of things. The promoters of Woodstock brought in a group from New Mexico called the Hog Farm Commune. They'd been brought in to, among other duties, help some attendees high on drugs go through withdrawal. Right. And through those 2 nights in what was known as a freak-out tent, I could hear the shouts and the moans as people came down from their highs. That and 2 deaths during the festival were the low points of the weekend. But all in all, it was a good weekend. And then again, I'm standing there on this hillside, thank God, near the state troopers' facilities, and I'm figuring out how the heck are we going to get out of here? Well, I want you to know, Doug, those corned beef and pastrami sandwiches came in very, very good because they gave us a state trooper in one of those patrol cars with the lights and the sirens and the whir, and we got in the back and we sirened our way through the crowds back to the little international airport, and we chartered a little plane and we flew back down to LaGuardia. And I brought all my tapes and everything like that back to WNEW. And in those days, 50 years ago, we had editors, we had producers, we had reporters, and our producers put together a 25-minute show called Weekend at White Lake, the Woodstock Festival. And what was interesting about that is, aside from a brief opening and a brief close, all of that 25 minutes was actuality. There was no real reporting or scripting. They put it together, and to this day, it's a great show. By and large, that weekend was a weekend of peace and love. Mr. and Mrs. Eisgrau, who owned the farm, they told our WNEW producers they were impressed with how polite and well-behaved were the concert-goers whom they met. And that's, you know me, I never can be brief. So
no, it's a great story, and you and I have talked about this obviously before on the 40th and before that. But now again, 1969. This obviously became a film. I know that became a famous documentary about Woodstock, and then it kind of led to other festivals around the country. I guess there was one in San Francisco. I don't know if that was before or after Woodstock, but people say it changed music back then. I never really followed it that closely because I was only in 3rd grade. So I'm glad I know you, Mike, so I can find out what happened.
Great. I was 114 years old at that time. What did I tell you? There is a postscript to the story. And that is, every 5 years, from 69, 74, 79, 84, 89, 94, 99, somebody in New York radio would call me and say, hey, Eisgrau, we want you to come on. It's the 20th anniversary of this, that, and the other thing. And we would do a half hour, whatever we're going to do an interview about that weekend, just as we're doing now 50 years later. And what's interesting about that is, now that I think back over it, I listened to the music on these rock stations as it transcended, as it moved on from 1969 to 1999. And you could tell the development of rock music, of rap, of some of the other genres, and it was quite interesting to see how each of these 5-year periods, they looked at this iconic festival from a different perspective. There's another postscript to the story. More than 25 years ago, the Eisgrau farm, as a matter of fact, about 2,000 acres, was bought by a cable TV billionaire named Alan Gary. He made his money in, he was a billionaire. He made his money in cable TV. He has poured more than $150 million into the site to create the Bethel Woods Center for the Art.
Right.
Something like Ravinia, north of Chicago, or up in Massachusetts, the Great Festival up in Massachusetts. It has a huge stage, and it faces a 4,800-seat audience built into that hillside, with room behind those seats for 12,000 more. Over the years, performers have ranged from rock groups to the New York Philharmonic. Now, part of that complex is a digital museum. It opened up in 2008. They invited me to come on up, but I was down here at my office in Florida. But it tells the story of that weekend of the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th of August of 1969. And it's got a psychedelic school bus. It's got all sorts of paraphernalia. It's got the posters. It has little kiosks where you sit down on a bench and you push a button and you see a 2 or 3 minute video of different aspects of that weekend. And quite interesting. Matter of fact, the people who really lost out, and it was big time for them in those dollars, was American Express, because American Express was going to bankroll that thing for about $3 million, and they were going to recoup their money because they were going to charge admission fees.
Right.
However, expecting 50,000 and getting 400,000, the fences were trampled down, and the promoters had to say, okay, it's a free concert. But in that museum, besides the kiosks and all the other paraphernalia, is an IMAX screen with an 11-minute film on it. And I double-checked with the current curator of the museum. His name is Wade Lawrence. He's the director of the museum up there. And I said, am I still there? He said yes, because part of that film, the IMAX film, it begins with these words. This site is hard to believe. We're over the top of the hill now and over the main stage, and for perhaps half a mile, all you can see are people. So if anybody has any desire to hear this character who they're listening to now, up there, what Wade Lawrence tells me is that that's part of the permanent exhibition. And I'll add one more thing. Over the past year, we've been negotiating with PBS, with the people who produced the American Experience, that great documentary series they have on public broadcasting. And I'm told, I'm waiting to see what happens. I think the previews came out already. I only knew they had a rough cut, but apparently they've cleaned it up, and they're going to put it on the air probably in August. I'm told that the words I've just uttered are going to be, at least part of them, part of that documentary.
Oh, great.
So that's something to look forward to. Of course, we're talking about a visual thing as opposed to radio. But in radio, we did not have, at that time, we didn't have iPhones and all that, but we did have eyes. And that's the best way I was able to describe for our WNEW audience what I saw there 50 years ago.
Yeah. Mike Eisgrau has been our guest, again, reminiscing about Woodstock, August of 1969. And before we wrap up, Mike, we always got to chat a little bit about the great radio station WNEW. I've had a chance here in Florida to work at a couple of stations and do similar types of shows where we got to play the American popular standards, and of course that was so well known for that music, but also, like you said, the great news department that you were part of there at WNEW. Unfortunately went off the air in 1992, but boy, I talk to people down here and people online, and people just still remember that station and miss it.
Well, let me tell you something. I had come back to WNEW. The irony of that is I was, at the time, back in 1965 through 67, I had left WLS ABC Radio News in Chicago, and I worked the 4 to midnight shift there writing radio newscasts, excuse me, while I did my graduate work in journalism at Northwestern University's Medill Graduate School. But I wanted to get on the air, and they weren't going to put a 24-year-old stunk on the air in the second largest market in the country, so I made a decision to go to Elkhart and South Bend, Indiana, 114 miles east of Chicago. And for that, I earned, when I came there, $92.50 a week. 6 days a week, $15 a day, and for that I was the television newscaster, the anchorman. I was the radio broadcaster. I think I swept the floors, but that's where you learned your business. And after 2 years of that, a good friend of mine, Mort Krim, was able to get me an interview with the news director of WNEW in New York. So I went in, I talked to him and all that. He said, all right, kid, I'll get back to you. And nothing happened for 14 months. And I'm cobbling together my little local television newscast one day in May of 1967 when the phone rings. And the guy says, Eisgrau, is that you? I said, yeah. He says, this is Jack. When can you be here? What? Jack? Where am I calling? I don't know anything west of the Hudson. What's this, Indiana? Yeah, Jack. He says, do you want the job or not? And I went, bop, 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 bop. Well, yeah. He says, good, I got to go home and eat. I'll tell you tomorrow, we'll talk money. Hung up the phone, and with a big grin on my face, I went on the air, smiling. I think I was doing a triple homicide. It was really a weird time. And the next day he called, offered me 3 times whatever the heck I was earning in Elkhart, Indiana, and I came to WNEW. Now, I had a 5-person news department in Elkhart. That's all we could afford to cover radio and television. I came to WNEW, and for just radio alone, with one independent station, they had a 28-person news department.
Wow.
I could not believe it. I couldn't believe the professionals I was with. I looked around and I saw there was a news director and an assistant news director and editors on the desk, and 24 hours this and 24 hours that. My first assignment was to work the 4 to midnight shift on something called Jim Lowe's New York. Oh, yeah. Jim Lowe, many people may not know, was another one of the icons of radio broadcasting. He's the guy who wrote the song Green Door.
Green Door, yeah.
Yeah, a long time ago. And Jim Lowe's New York, to show you how big radio broadcasting was then as opposed to today, Jim Lowe had a 4-hour show from 8 to midnight with the concept that news is made not just during the day but at night. And our reporters are out there covering it. And I would get my assignment to cover some festival or to cover some shooting or something like that. And I remember more than one night I was sent to cover the riots in Newark, New Jersey. And those were that was a terrible time because 34 people lost their lives as the African American community vented its anger. And Jim would start the show some nights with what they called a round robin, a tease as to what the reporters were doing out in the field. And one night he came to me, and I'm underneath the news unit, and he said, Mike Eisgrau's out in the troubles out in Newark. Mike, what's going on? And when he turned on my mic, all you heard was, well, Jim, I have to keep low because they're shooting, Jim. Mike, are you there? Yes, Jim. Okay, we'll get back to you, Mike. That's how we started that show. And it really was a good show, but it showed you that we had an audience, even at night, that listened to radio, and it listened to the theater of the air by a sound as opposed to just pictures. So it was a great radio station then. As I started this interview with you, this little chat, in 67, 68, and 69 were incredible years with the anti-war movement, with the African American community rising up, trying to get ahead. So they were great years. And yes, you're right. WNEW. We're not going to see that again.
No. Although I think we are moving into an era now. We mentioned before we went on about podcasting. This is going to be podcast, this particular interview, which I think there's a lot of great work being done, kind of like in the old traditional style of radio. So it's out there. You have to kind of find it. It's not exactly broadcast the same way, but they are becoming more popular, and I think we can do stories like this way because we have the luxury of more time and your great description. So we appreciate you taking it to kind of reminisce about Woodstock. For people that weren't there, I think they're very interested in what is this all about, this rock concert. So you really had the bird's eye view, and Mike, always a pleasure, and we thank you for kind of telling that story again. It's a wonderful story.
Oh, listen, it's my pleasure, Doug, and you wouldn't be interested in a couple of corned beef and pastrami sandwiches.
We got to have one of these days. Downtown Sarasota. If anybody serves that in Sarasota, I don't know.
By all means, Doug. A pleasure being with you. Thanks so much for having me on.